Alright guys, today I'm installing TC Bros forward controls on my Sportster, and for this one I opted to go with the option without the pegs. Got pegs from Lowbrow Customs, and together this should be everything we need to get this thing going. So I got everything laid out here. I'm ready to start with the disassembly of the stock pegs. So you can really do this in any order you want. I decided to start with the shift peg. This just has a bolt that kind of clamps down on the geared shaft. Once you get it loose, it should slide right off. Should is the key word here. If yours is gunked up like mine, you might need to spray it with a little WD-40 or penetrating oil and let it sit for a little bit. Next up, went for the foot peg. This just has a bolt that goes in and kind of pinches it in there. Arguably, you could skip this step and just go right to removing the mount, which I do next. For whatever reason, this is the way I decided to go. So these two bolts right here hold the mount for that peg. These have to be replaced. They're part of the primary cover, but without the peg mount there, they're actually going to be a little bit too long, so you're either going to have to put some kind of spacer in there or get shorter bolts, which is what I ended up doing. Once you got those removed, you just got to try and slide this around your clutch cable and ding up your primary cover as little as possible. So my shifter ended up being really stuck on there, so I went with the 2-jaw puller to help me out. It marred up the shifter a little bit, but I'm not planning on reusing it, so I'm not too concerned. Then we're on to the next side here. Going with the foot pick again, just a bolt and a nut all the way through. I ran into the problem getting the bolt out for the peg because the brake pedal was in the way. I don't know if this was assembled wrong by the previous owner or if this is typical, but just move on from here. Then next we're on to the front sprocket cover. Something to keep in mind is all these bolts are not the same length, so you got to remember where they come out of. You could do that by putting them loosely back in the cover or putting them on a piece of cardboard or just laying them out in a way that you can remember. So the master cylinder for the rear brake just has 2 bolts holding it on. So to remove the master cylinder shaft from the brake lever itself, there's a cylinder that's inserted and then there's a pin that goes all the way through. So you got to kind of get behind it once you remove the pin and pry out that cylinder. So it looks just like that. So at this point I realized I couldn't keep doing this with the exhaust installed, so I started removing that. Got a little creative with the pry bar here to hold the brake out of the way. So for the exhaust, there's the 1 hanger nut, and there's 2 up here holding it to the engine. So you see the 1 nut here, it's real tight with the frame, so you gotta figure out your best option with what you got to get in there. Once those are removed, it just comes right off. And now we can get to that bolt that was underneath that exhaust there. So to remove the rear exhaust, the nut on the hanger is kind of hidden behind. You got to squeeze a wrench in there to get that nut off. And then the same thing, you have 2 nuts up on the engine, and they're not easy to get to. And then there's the last bolt before you can take this cover off. Now you kind of got to hold the brake master cylinder out of the way, but be careful not to bend that hard line because it'll kink and cause you all kinds of problems. So here on the back side you can see how there's a pin that holds the brake pivot in place. And after that you just put that sprocket cover back on. So now we're on the last step of removing stuff, which is removing the front motor mounts. The TC Bros kit actually replaces the front motor mounts with new ones with the forward controls integrated right into them. And with those removed, we're finally ready to install the new kit. So here's the first motor mount we're going to put on. And this kit was complete with all new hardware, spacers, everything you need to get this installed. So really at this point we're following the manual that came with the kit of which bolts go where and where to have the spacers. It's important to keep everything kind of loose as you start putting it in. That way you don't have any issues lining anything up. You can make adjustments on the fly. And then we got everything all squared away, we can torque it down. So this long bolt's a little tricky and exactly why I want to keep everything loose. This is the only bolt that goes from one side of the motor mount to the other. So you kind of got to maneuver both plates to make sure it's lined up and threads properly. The last thing you want to do is cross thread this because you're going to ruin the whole thing. And now we're ready to torque everything down. Okay, so now that all the bolts for the mounts are torqued, we're going to go towards the foot peg assembly. So those bolts that we put in before, now we're just going to thread this pre-assembled thing right on it. So when you're getting this on, you want to make sure that you tighten it down so that it's going to be at like a 45-degree angle towards the back of the bike, and that's to allow the peg to fold up if you ever were to hit something. So in order to tighten this, I just stuck a rod I had in the garage right through the bolt hole, and I torqued it from the back side. Now the kit doesn't actually give you a torque value for this because they said you can't actually get a torque wrench back there. So just make these snug. You know, you don't want anything coming loose on you, but you don't want to go crazy and break anything either. Okay, now for the linkages, you have these threaded rods, and the way you have these set up is you got to thread a nut on first, then these eyelets. And the reason is you're going to use that nut as a jam nut to stop that from spinning when you got it all adjusted. And you do the same thing for the other end. And then the peg on this side goes on the exact same way as the other side. Again, keeping in mind to keep that at a roughly 45-degree angle. The foot peg install is real straightforward, just a bolt and a nut. I tried to torque this down enough so that it wasn't freely flopping around, but it was still able to move if it needed to. Next up is the new shifter arm. It just goes on that same tooth shaft. I had to use the dead blow to tap it on a little. Be careful doing this. You don't want to hit it too hard and break something internally. Then you just tighten down that pinch nut and you should be all set. We have the linkage for this side then. It's set up just the same way as the other one. Now the one difference with this shaft is it has a bend in it to make sure it doesn't come in contact with the primary cover, so you got to make sure that that's all set up the way you need it to. And now it's important before you tighten these bolts down is you want to make sure you set the length on these. There's not necessarily a right or wrong length. It's just to where you want the shifter peg to sit under your foot. There we have it, all installed. I think it looks great. Huge improvement over stock. I really can't wait to get this thing out and give it a ride. Thanks guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to subscribe if you want to see more like it.